This is Hannah. This is Betty. And this is Princess Button. Welcome to the Motocross Vault. I liked that one.
Hello, this is Tony Blazer back for another video for the Motocross Vault reviews here on YouTube. And for this one, what we're going to do is look back at one of the most iconic machines of the 1980s, the Honda ATC 250R. This was the first high-performance three-wheeler ever offered for sale. Honda, being the inventor of the ATC initially, held all the patents, so they had a big head start there on the competition. And it really was one of the leaders the whole time it was in production. The bike only existed for a few short years before problems with the government, and then eventually the four-wheeler kind of took it over. But for a few short years, the ATC 250R was certainly one of the most popular and most beloved machines in all of off-road motorsports. This is going to cover basically all the models from the original in 1981 through its eventual demise in 1986. And I hope you enjoy it. If you like this kind of stuff, subscribe to the new channel. Share it on social media if you would, and ding that little bell to get updated when we do a new one. And feel free to support the channel with some Motocross Vault merch as well at redbubble.com. The link will be in the description. And hope you enjoy it. Before we get into the 250R, I wanted to take a second and look back at the origins of Honda's ATC program. The ATC, or all-terrain cycle, had been out already for a little over a decade by the time the 250R was released in 1981. Honda's original ATC here was the ATC 90, and in 1970 it was actually under a different name, the US 90, as Honda was waiting to patent that and copyright that name, ATC. The original one here was an 89cc single four-stroke, putting out a very modest 7 horsepower. Now this original design had been started in 1967 under a gentleman by the name of Osamu Teikuchi. I could be butchering that, I apologize. Japanese names aren't my forte. But this gentleman working at Honda had been tasked with finding a vehicle for Honda's dealers to sell during the winter months. Motorcycling, for obvious reasons, is more of a spring, summer, fall kind of sport. And if you were at a dealership where you had pretty hard winters and you didn't sell snowmobiles, sales could take a hit. So they had some ideas that something a little more all-seasonal might be a good thing for their dealers. Now, Mr. Teikuchi, when he was looking at this, he had taken a look at all different kind of variations from 2 wheels to 3 wheels, 4 wheels, even 6 wheels. 6-wheeled ATVs or like all-terrain vehicles were pretty big in the 60s, and plus dune buggies were all the rage. So there were a lot of different variations there. In the end, they came up with this iconic 3-wheel design. It gave them the best combination of sort of motorcycle handling in a lightweight package. This original one had no suspension. The only suspension is these high flotation balloon tires. Really more of a kind of a play bike to go down the dunes here, play in the snow, mess around in a creek or something. Not a high performance machine by any means. As you can see here with this full-size adult on it, it's pretty cramped for a full-size human to be on, but this really was a groundbreaking machine. It was the kind of machine where someone who didn't feel comfortable on a motorcycle could jump on it and feel comfortable right off the bat. Especially this early one where the speeds were very low. You weren't kind of trying to jump it, certainly, or go crazy with it doing power slides and all the stuff that would get people in trouble later. If you just putted it around the backyard, around the campsite, these early ATVs were no harder to drive than like a lawn tractor. It was misleadingly simple. They used an automatic clutch. There was nothing like that to learn. Very simple, rugged, reliable. And Honda ended up selling a bazillion of these things. In the 70s, they were hugely popular. Before they went away, they sold like 6.5 million ATCs. So gives you an idea. At a time when off-road motorcycling was exploding in popularity, pretty much no machine around was as popular as these ATVs. They flew off the shelves. A couple of years after the original 90 was released, Honda added a 70cc version to the lineup here. Give you something for junior to ride while you're kind of puttering around your campsite or your sand dunes, wherever. The success of the original ATC certainly took Honda's competition by surprise, but they were not able to do much about it. Honda held several very strong patents on this three-wheeled ATV overall design, and they weren't able to do any direct competition without violating those patents. So it would be almost a decade, or a little over a decade, until any of the competitors will come out with something to kind of go head to head with this original ATC. Now, one kind of negative effect of that was the lack of competition led Honda to do not a whole lot of updates to the machine. Throughout the whole decade of the 70s, it really didn't change hardly at all. In 1975 here you get a fairly minor update. There's still no suspension, but there is a new wheel and tire design. It got rid of the original hubless tires. Those were a pain to service if you got a flat. I went with these more durable new tires and actually had real rims, so it was much easier to change a tire if necessary and service them. The models continued to be just the ATC 90 here and the ATC 70 for the small kids. Again, very low performance, kind of a puttering around machine, and probably in the end, probably to Honda's benefit, because it wasn't as encouraging of people riding them aggressively and getting into trouble like it would be later once they started boosting their performance. For 1979, Honda finally did give a small upgrade in performance to the ATC by upgrading its 89cc motor to a 105. It was still a four-stroke single, still nothing to write home to mother about in terms of performance, and as you can see here, still sized for a Hobbit. The lack of suspension and the cramped ergonomics certainly were pretty brutal on a full-size adult, but it didn't stop people from buying these things and having their kidneys bashed all around campsites and dunes around America. A year later, in 1980, Honda introduced a very important machine in terms of ATV history, the original ATC 185S. Now, to look at this machine here with the optional racks installed, it's clearly not a racing machine. But, believe it or not, this was the basis for a huge boom in ATV racing. A couple of important things about this. The 185 with its 180cc engine put out roughly twice the horsepower of the 110. That alone made it a much higher performance machine, but the engine was based loosely on the motor found on like the XRs, so there were a lot of hop-up parts that could be easily added to this ATC to boost performance. This is also the first ATV or ATC with a motorcycle type frame. If you see here, it has a real down tube. The motor is not used as a stress member. That made it much easier to upgrade the chassis with full suspension. And a lot of manufacturers in the aftermarket were quick to build chassis that would add suspension to these things so you could race them. Believe it or not, a lot of people sunk all kinds of money into racing these darn things. Obviously, by modern standards, it seems a little bit crazy to think of this thing as a race bike, but at the time, this was a high performance, in quotes, ATV. In 1981, this shift towards performance really hit overdrive with the introduction of Honda's first truly high performance ATV, the all-new ATC 250R. Using a high performance two-stroke single for power and boasting full suspension front and rear, which were both first for Honda ATVs, the 250R was clearly aimed at a different customer than its previous three-wheel brothers. Loosely based off their successful CR250R motor, the new 248cc power plant featured a manual clutch, kick-starting, a close ratio 5-speed transmission, and a counterbalancer to quell vibration. Although in a much milder state of tune than its CR cousin, this new 250R motor pumped out power far in excess of anything else ever seen on a stock three-wheeler. The suspension on this new machine was pretty modest by motocross standards, but for an ATV, like I said, this was revolutionary. The front forks were based off the ones found on the Honda CR80 and featured 6.7 inches of travel. Out back, it used a monoshock that put out 4.3 inches of travel. Now again, when you consider that the CRs were only receiving a monoshock in 1981, that was pretty impressive. This was right up there with the motocross in terms of overall design, but certainly not in terms of performance. It had a lot less travel, wasn't as high-tech, did not have the same kind of capability you would have found on an Elsinore motocrosser in 81. Now, one thing that is interesting, if you look at this first 81, it has a front disc brake, and that was something that no motocross bikes had in 1981. So in some ways, this ATV was ahead of that, ahead of the curve. Definitely a mind-blowing machine in 1981. As you can see here, racing through the dunes, the bike was very much at home. These early ones had very balloony tires. The suspension, as you can see here, is not the best. If you're going to try some crusty demons of dirt stuff, you're going to kill yourself probably. The bike would probably bounce as high back up in the air as what you jumped it. But again, compared to an ATC 185, this was just mind-blowing. These bikes were very torquey. Wasn't a ton of top end power, but they had good low end, and with the counterbalancer, very smooth. Certainly smoother than what you would have found on a CR. The stock exhaust's pretty quiet. The kickstarting was a little odd. It kicked forward instead of back to clear the foot pegs. They had to make a few design choices in order to accommodate the three-wheel design. But this really was a revolution. Very quickly after this thing was introduced, people started racing them in the desert, racing them in TT, flat track, all kinds of stuff. Instead of having to buy an all-new frame and suspension and spend thousands of dollars turning a little mild-mannered XR into a racer, you had a bike that right out of the crate could compete in a lot of ATV racing without too much in the way of modifications. It was a very impressive machine for its time. For 1982, the ATC 250R was back with only the most minor of changes. The rear suspension, front suspension was all the same. The 248cc motor was also unchanged, although there was a new intake system that had a little snorkel that was up underneath the frame there to get a little more fresh air to the motor, and also prevent from sucking water through if you tried to take it through a creek or a stream. The rear drum brake was also ditched in favor of a rear hydraulic disc brake. Again, this is pretty advanced stuff for 1982. No motocross bikes of any kind had disc brakes at this time, aside from actually a Rokon, I guess, in the mid-70s. But none of these CR Honda or any of the competitors were using anything other than drums. So in spite of the fact that a lot of people think these are play bikes, there was some technology on there that was exclusive to the ATC that wasn't even on the motocross versions. Other than that, the 82 here was very similar, used the same pretty much everything, same tire, same motor, all that stuff was unchanged. But for 83, they had big changes ahead. For 1983, Honda introduced their first major redesign of the 250R. This new bike was majorly redesigned on the chassis side, suspension-wise. All that was brand new. The motor itself was only mildly revised for 82. It still was, I'm sorry, for 83. It was still air-cooled. The engine did get a larger carburetor. The minuscule 27 millimeter carb was up to a 30 millimeter, still far smaller than like a 36 or even a 38 you would have found on a 250. The exhaust was also new, freer flowing, and they added a couple little ram scoops to the metal tank to get a little more air to the engine. Engine itself, though, was basically the same power plant it had been in 81 and 82. It was still a two-stroke, still a 5-speed with a manual clutch, which, again, was pretty innovative in the ATV world. Prior to the 250R, no ATVs had manual clutches. Now, on the suspension side, the bike was completely new. The frame was totally redesigned, as I said. The forks were beefier for 1983, larger diameter. They also offered more suspension travel. In the rear, the suspension was completely redesigned and incorporated Honda's ProLink rear shock for the first time. Now, the ProLink was Honda's name for their single shock, rising rate linkage suspension. And by going to the ProLink, they were able to double suspension travel for 1983 while only adding 2 inches of overall seat height. Now, that was done here by laying the shock down. As you can see, it's laid down very, very low, very dissimilar to what you would have found on a motocross bike. That allowed them to get the travel without jacking the seat to the moon. Now, tires were also new. These still look fairly balloony by modern standards on an ATV. Probably more like what you'd see on a utility, but for 83, these were much more aggressive and much lower profile than what they've been in 81 and 82. The forks were narrower. The front tire was taller and of narrower profile to give it much better tracking, better steering. They were kind of getting the handle on what worked best as far as ATV handling. And as you can see, the forks here are trailing axle. On a motorcycle, you would see like a leading axle fork. And on the ATVs here, they went with a trailing axle for some reason. I'm sure the logic there has something to do with the rake and trail, but I'm no engineer. I'm not sure why they decided to go with that, but it was always one of those interesting tidbits on these bikes. For 1984, the ATC 250R was back with some minor refinements. There was an all-new shock added that increased stroke over 1983, and a all-new redesigned ProLink rear suspension that was supposed to have a more progressive curve to the linkage. The engine was the same as 1983, with the exception of some new porting specs inside the motor and a higher compression head. Overall power was up a little bit. In 83, it had gone up 2 horsepower, and you gain a little bit more here for 84. Still not nearly as powerful as what you would have had on a CR at the time, but again, for ATVs, it was pretty potent. Now, one really significant thing here for 1984 is the fact that this is the first year where Honda gets any competition. Prior to this, they really were the only game in town. Like I said, for the first decade, there weren't any other ATVs at all. But starting in the early 80s, Yamaha, Kawasaki, even Suzuki eventually started getting into some ATV stuff here. And for 1984, Kawasaki introduced their first true competitor to the 250R, the all-new KXT 250 Ducati. Like the 250R, the new Ducati borrowed from the motocross world and had full suspension front and rear. It also was liquid cooled, something the 250R lacked in 1984. Now, as a result, it did have a radiator here. You can see it puts that radiator up on the handlebars. That necessitated putting the headlight above it, which, in my opinion, looks terrible. Kind of reminiscent of the early XRs. Overall, in the aesthetics department, I think the 250R crushes this thing. I'm sure there's plenty of Ducati aficionados. I know a lot of guys like this thing, but I always thought the thing looked goofy. Now, it did come in green or this red. That was kind of cool. You get your Kawasaki's in different colors in 1984. A couple of other things you're going to notice about the Ducati. The tires have a larger rim, you'll see here. That's going to give it a lower overall profile. The Ducati is going to have a better sliding capability than the 84 250R. Overall, the bike handled better. It was more racy, more motocrossy. It wasn't quite as stable at speed, but the bike was quicker to change corners, change directions, and the motor itself was more potent as well. This liquid-cooled version came standard with a twist throttle, unlike the thumb throttle on the 250R, and this motor was very powerful. Down low, the 250R was pretty competitive. The 250R is very torquey, but once in the mid-range and the top end, the original Ducati here just kind of walked away from it. It didn't really have much for it. It was a huge advantage for Kawasaki in performance. I think by most people's standards, they still thought the 250R was a better overall handler in 1984, but this really was Honda being on notice that they couldn't just have the class to themselves anymore. They were going to have some serious competition. Thankfully for Honda, they were up to the challenge for 1985, and they introduced an all-new 250R to take on the Kawasaki and a couple of new rivals. The all-new 250R was liquid-cooled for the first time. Beautiful machine, as you can see here. It has a very CR-like appearance. This is my favorite era for the Honda CRs in terms of looks, and this is by far my favorite looking ATV of all time. I just love this look overall. Both the front forks and rear shock had an additional 2 inches of travel, with the new Showa shock offering 17 adjustments on compression and 12 adjustments on rebound. There was a new ProLink linkage to go with it, and it offered a total of 9.8 inches of travel. Up front, they upped the rather small 35mm forks that had been used in 84 to a full 39mm. Again, much smaller than the 43 that would have been seen on a motocross bike at the time, but large and beefy for an ATV. The forks were still trailing axle. Again, not sure why, but there was no adjustment for compression, damping, or rebound, but they did have Schrader valves on top to adjust the air pressure to kind of fine-tune the ride. In terms of performance, the new 85 250R was a huge step up from 84. The new chassis was lower, longer, and wider. The tires were more low profile, still not quite as low profile as what was on the Kawasaki Ducati, but an improvement over 84. It maintained that narrow profile front end. The new beefier forks gave much better feedback to the front end. There was less flex and more stability than 84. The engine, as I said, was liquid cooled, although it did lack the ATAC, which was the ATAC power valve system found on the motocross bikes at the time. That was a variable, like a valve that went onto the exhaust port that changed the volume of the head pipe depending on our engine RPMs. It was designed to broaden the power band. It was always a fairly dubious effectiveness. Some people actually even removed them on the CR125s at the time. So the fact that it wasn't on the 250R probably wasn't a huge loss. but it was basically a simple two-stroke design, basically what you would have found on a CR500 or something at the time. The motor did have a larger carb for 1985, went up from 30 millimeters to 34 millimeters. And with all those changes, it added up to a whopping 42% increase in power over 84, which was pretty substantial. As in years past, it was still significantly less than what you would have found on the CR250, but very, very impressive for an ATV. This basically brought it up to snuff, at least on low to mid power with the Takati, although the Takati continued to outpower it on top end. The motor was also much more pleasant to live with than the Kawasaki. The Kawasaki lacked the calendar balancer that the Honda had, so the Honda provided much less vibration. That played dividends on your hands and also kept nuts and bolts from vibrating loose as quickly. Overall suspension was excellent. It had by far the best suspension in the class this year. And that includes the new competition it got as well. In 1985, the 250R got a lot more competition in the form of a new three-wheel version from Yamaha, the Tri-Z 250, and Suzuki's entry, which would turn out to be by far the biggest threat to the 250R's domination, the new Suzuki LT 250R Quad Racer. Now, this was the first year for the Quad Racer, the first year for any kind of high-performance quad. They had introduced a few utility versions earlier than this, but this is the first one that really made a dent in the high performance wars. On the track and trail, the Quad Racer actually wasn't faster than the 250R. The 250R outpowered it. This early Quad Racer used a form of a dual sport motor. It was actually pretty mellow. If you ever rode one, it wasn't a ripper by any means. And the suspension actually fairly mediocre on this first version as well. The Honda had better suspension, but it really just couldn't compete with the stability the Quad offered. Even with worse suspension and a slower motor, the 250R had a hard time keeping up with it on the track due to the stability advantage the Quad had. Coming into 1986, it was pretty clear that the writing was on the wall for Honda's ATC program. At the time, there was a great deal of pressure coming from the federal government in regards to the safety of ATVs and ATCs in particular. It wasn't really looking good for the future of three-wheelers in general. The introduction of the four-wheelers was also quickly pointing the way towards the future of ATV design. The arrival of the Quad Racer in 85 and Honda's own four-tracks 250R in 1986 very much signaled the end of the ATC era. So for 1986, Honda figured they'd go out with a bang with their best and most refined version of the ATC 250R. For 86, Honda added some minor refinements. It wasn't a big change after all the redesign in 1985. The seat was slightly taller. That was to aid rider movement, make it a little less cramped. And the head angle was also altered 0.5 degrees. They also changed the swing arm as well. All that added up to a 0.4-inch increase in wheelbase for 86. The new swing arm was redesigned to aid chain adjustment and simplify maintenance, and they also bolted on a 1.5-inch wider rear axle to increase stability. Finally, they changed from Dunlop to Otsu for the tires and bolted on a new flat slide Keihin carburetor to give the bike more responsive low to mid power. In terms of overall performance, the new 250R was not a huge improvement over 1985. The chassis did handle a little better. The motor was a little more snappy with the new flat slide carburetor, but it really didn't handle or run much different than it did the year before. The 39mm forks continue to be the best forks in the class, and the rear Pro Link was ultra plush. For hardcore motocross use, if you're actually going to race it like a guy like Marty Hart here, you're going to want to have both ends modified. But for the kind of mixed use that most 250Rs saw, where you do some trail riding, some dune riding, occasionally maybe go to a track or something, the bike was well set up for that. The exhaust was very quiet. Overall, it was an excellent do-it-all ATV. It really, again, couldn't really compete with the four-wheelers, its own Honda teammate, or the Quad Racer in terms of stability, but for a three-wheeler, it was an excellent, excellent machine. Overall, it kind of fit in between the extremes of the Tri-Z and the Takati. The Takati continued to be much more serious for motocross in terms of the power band and the handling. The Takati was all new for 1986, liquid cooled, very KX inspired. The motor that year got a new KIPS, which was Kawasaki's integrated power valve system. And it had by far the most power in the class, but it continued to have no counterbalancer, have a kind of a more aggressive power band that was great for motocross racing, but not as good in the woods or just for general use trail riding. The suspension and handling, again, were more aggressive than the Honda. The Honda kind of fit the difference between the aggressive Kawasaki and the more sedate Yamaha. For 1986, the Yamaha did receive a number of improvements that addressed the 85 version's shortcomings. A new set of forks brought the tubes up to 39 millimeters, which were the same as the Honda. The bike also got a 6-speed transmission and a set of lower profile tires in the rear to help with the tippiness the 85 model had. In spite of all these issues, though, it still remained the most sedate. Power was, it wasn't slow by any means, but it wasn't as aggressive as the Honda or the Kawasaki particularly. And the overall handling was, kind of middle of the road. More slow handling, not as aggressive as the Honda or the Kawasaki, which was, as I said, by far the most aggressive turning machine in the class. Basically, the Honda split the difference between these two machines and offered the best all-around package if you were going to do more than just motocross race or play in the dunes. If you wanted to do a little bit of trail riding, a little bit of wood stuff, and take it occasionally to the motocross track, the 250R was the machine to get. The counterbalancer also delivered a lot less vibration, made the bike more pleasant, and the plush suspension was excellent for its time. Overall, the only bike that beat it out in 1986 was the competitor of its own brand, the Honda 4Trax 250R. The 250R was similarly powered, obviously just had a little bit less get up and go because of the added weight. The new four-wheel chassis delivered, but it had way better stability and the suspension was even better than the three-wheel version. So there you have it, a look back at the original high-performance ATC, the Honda 250R. From 1981 till its demise in 1986, at least here in America. I think they maybe made one in Canada in 87, it's hard to tell. There were some pictures of them. You can see in some brochures. I don't know if it ever actually made production. But from the time it was introduced here, at least in 81 until 86, it was kind of the high water mark for do-it-all, three-wheeled, high-performance fun. It wasn't quite as razor-edge, hard-edged as the Ducati, but if you were going to do a little bit of everything, the 250R was the way to go. Again, I still think this is the best-looking three-wheeler of all time. Everything from the graphics here, this red color to the gold rims, the overall styling, it still holds up, still looks great today. If you're going to race a classic three-wheeler now, your chances are you're going to find somebody on a 250R. They hold up with some mods. They are really potent machines even now. And the bike definitely has withstood the test of time. I've ridden plenty of these things. They are a handful if you're not used to it. I had the original 4Trax 250R as well, and it was certainly a lot easier to ride than this. It wasn't quite as powerful, but the stability thing always made the four-wheelers more attractive to me. The three-wheelers, I had an odd habit of running my leg over and cartwheeling the damn thing. So I always kind of shied away from these. I like to look at them more than ride them, but the people who knew how to manhandle them and take care of them and respect them certainly enjoyed them, and it's kind of sad that they're gone, but they were definitely an awesome machine in their time, and really an iconic machine of the 80s for sure. Well, if you enjoy this kind of thing, make sure you check out the rest of the videos on the channel here, the Motocross Vault Reviews. I've done several machines. I'll be doing several more. You can also follow me on social media. I post classic videos and photos and such every day on Twitter and Instagram. That is at Tony Blazer. That's at TonyBlazier. You can also follow my writing at PulpMX. I just did a write-up on this bike, the ATC 250R as well, at pulpmx.com, as well as about 130 other classic machines if you're into this kind of thing. So feel free to check that out. Again, I certainly appreciate you watching, and if you could share this on social media, I would very much appreciate it. And until we meet again, keep the rubber side down and keep the throttle on.